So, hello everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the CS Academy Live. And I'm excited to have Emma here. Emma, you're based at the moment in London, but I know you are from Wales. And I know you are as excited as I am talking today about psychology in customer success. And before we go and talk about your experience, in particular in psychology, I would love to, tell folks a little bit about why we came across this topic. As you know, mostly we both, I think, talk on LinkedIn about efficiency and how we need to tell our stories a little bit better, and how we just need to prove that we can add value on a regular basis. But I feel we do not really speak often enough about what it actually does to us and this stress that we need to deal with that happens to us on a regular basis. It's something we just accept or not really look at or speak about. And I think this is why we came or defined this topic. So really let's deep dive into that, because we both have a background in psychology. And I think we both love to talk about psychology and leadership in particular, and where to really start when we need to lead our folks through changes that are extremely apparent at the moment, and where we need to make sure we sail through this all together. And I'm very excited to, of course, have you there. And I'm also excited to have so many guests here. And I encourage you to use the chat, please. I'm monitoring the chat. If you have any questions for Emma or for myself. So we'd love to have this really as a group moment where we just can have conversations and where we can just, influence each other and learn from each other going forward. This is, as I mentioned, a recorded session, and it's going to be available on YouTube and all other platforms where you can just listening to podcasts. So that's a little bit of the intro. Emma, I know you worked, or your background is psychology, as I mentioned, but I know you worked at John Lewis as well. But you have a career in customer success. You have been as a vice president there. You have knowledge in sales and customer success, and I know you love to forecast as well. Talking about psychology. What are you most excited about this topic in particular, and talking with me about psychology in CS today?
Oh, it's a great question. I think there's two things. One is very leadership focused. It's how you get the best out of the people that you're working with and who work for you, and the people that you work for as well, I suppose. Because ultimately, psychology being study of human behavior, we're all human, right? We work together. We have to understand how each other works and what makes each other tick, and that's hopefully will bring us to a more successful outcome. But I think specifically with regards to CS and sales to a much greater extent as well, understanding how to build successful relationships really underpins the vast majority of what we do. And understanding how to build successful relationships is built upon knowing how humans behave. So that's really how I look at it when you ask me that question.
Yeah. When we talk about leadership and psychology in particular, when did you come across in your career in customer success, when did you come across this topic of just basically using technologies, methodologies in psychology to really monitor or to, be better prepared in dealing with your folks and guiding your folks?
That's a difficult question. I think ultimately, everyone who has a general interest in psychology, and I remember one of my lecturers at university telling me this, anyone who goes to do a psychology course at university ultimately is looking to better understand themselves. And that has been true for me. I'm just fascinated ultimately by people, and certainly by introspection in terms of how I get the best out of myself. And I think through digging into that and digging into how you work best and how you function and how to put yourself in the best situation to do your best work and understanding yourself, it gives you the opportunity to create that space for the people you work with. So I know that, for instance, when I think about the sorts of questions that I ask myself, do I do my best work in the morning? Do I like going to the office? What sort of situations do I like? What sort of cultures do I thrive in? It then gives you, as a leader, the opportunity to give those same questions to your team so that they can present you back that information. Because I don't know how you feel, Thomas, but when I'm looking to build successful teams, the very first thing I'm looking to do is think about the skills and experiences that already exist and plug the gaps. Because, I'm, as much as I'd like to pretend I'm not great at a vast number of things. So the very first thing I'll do is hire somebody in who fills a particular gap so that we can play off each other. And really understanding your strengths and weaknesses gives you the ability to really present that space, not just for your team to reflect on theirs, but also the vulnerability to share, I suppose, is a great way of looking at it. And I think creating a space where there is psychological safety for failure, safety for vulnerability, to have those open conversations just creates a strong and resilient culture, first and foremost, but also an acceptance that we are all human and that we're not all excellent at everything, and that we do need to go on specific coaching and development journeys for specific skills, hard and soft. And I think really that was something that I learned quite early on in my leadership career, because quite frankly, when I left university, when I joined John Lewis, I was like, management training program. They literally gave me 21 people in a women's wear department in John Lewis in Bristol and were like, they're yours now. And I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And if you don't create that space to be vulnerable as a leader, you're never going to get that out of the people who work for you. So that's definitely, I think, where I come from that perspective. I don't know about you and how you feel about applying some of these principles.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested at uni, so I studied psychology, and to be honest, I grew up in a world where I was basically pushed into a corporate world very quickly, and where I needed to function, and where I worked for managers who, frankly, hadn't any clue of applying psychology or any methodologies going forward. I was potentially happy that I saw some empathy, or some nice managers, nice in terms of that they treated you nicely and potentially also gave you a little bit of feedback. And that was for me the normal, right? So that was whatever in the 90s and the 2000s, and I worked for mostly American companies, but I don't think that makes sense. But I worked for corporates, and I think if you work in a corporate environment, I think that really makes something with you, because you learn very quickly how a corporate system works, and you adapt very quickly. And I think my experience was like psychology and understanding humans, understanding the emotions, understanding a connection between your head, your emotions, your soul, and your body. It simply didn't exist. I think you were just basically running for the goal, running for the money, and I worked in sales as well as my first job, and that was it. So I luckily basically came across some folks, and I think it was like the beginning of the 2000 of leaders who, just as you said, behaved like human beings and said like, let's get this bullshit outside and just let's talk normal as we do. And people were interested in not only how I perform, but in how I feel, and I think that was interesting. And I said like, oh, that ignited some thoughts in myself. Said like, oh, what I mean, can I talk about emotions when I'm actually dealing with folks? So while I was progressing in my career, I said like, okay, here's my first principle. I do not want to replicate what I have been experienced from managers before. So, and then I gradually started to build my leadership style, which then compared with what I've learned and what I really then continuously learned, in leadership psychology, is what I think formed me nowadays. And you said this, I think the first principle is like, let's behave like a human being. And yes, we are under a lot of stress at the moment to get the numbers in, but to make sure, as a leader, you're dealing with humans, and you often, for example, do not know the context why people react as they do. So I think, first of all, having a sense of self-awareness is for me the key and the starting point for a good leader these days. And talking about this, I mean, self-awareness is something you can really learn very, very quickly. And there are a lot of techniques that you can apply as well, these days. And I'm assuming I'm not telling you anything new. How do you cultivate self-awareness, for example, in your roles?
It's a really good question. And I think just to add on to what you were saying, I think so often in the corporate structure, you do behave like a robot, emotionally, I would say. And it always makes me laugh when people talk about work-life balance, because there's no such thing. There's just life, right? And work intrinsically will affect how you feel in the rest of your life. And that is the basis, and we'll probably come onto this later, of burnout, essentially. And I'm sure most of us have experienced that at some point. And I think all too often you are promoted into positions because you're good at your job, right? But no one tells you, particularly for your first promotion, that your job has now changed. You're no longer just a high-performing customer success manager, high-performing salesperson. Being a leader is an entirely different job, and you're just not really prepared for that, I think, by most companies who kind of encourage you to take that step. But to self-awareness, I think there's two kind of major ways of doing it. One is through, obviously, introspection and asking yourself questions about, in which situations do you thrive? In which situations are you triggered? What are the things that turn you on, turn you off, turn you over, all of those sorts of things. There's also specific tools that you can use. Like, I'm not going to push psychometric testing, because from a scientific perspective, I do not believe in the validity of psychometric testing. But over my career, as I'm sure we all have, I've done DISCs, I've done MBTIs, I've done Hogan assessments, the one that's all the different colors. And I think that the real value in that is it gives you an opportunity to kind of answer the questions, see the results, and reflect on what it's telling you about yourself, which, to your point, is probably nothing you don't already know. Like, I didn't get anything from my MBTI report, let's say, that I didn't already know about myself, but just seeing it in black and white gave me the opportunity to reflect on what I was reading. And Enneagram was another one that I did a couple of years ago. And I was like, oh, turns out I'm a challenger. What a shock to anyone who knows me. But just seeing some of the pros and cons and who I work best with, and who might struggle with my communication style, just gives me the space to think about how I want people to get my communication, or how I want them to receive it. Because ultimately, much like value in customer success, I can't give you value as a customer. You have to receive it. You have to agree that you've received value in order for that to be communicated. So it's all well and good me running around, as blunt as I am, communicating in a way that works for me, with all the best intentions in the world, because it makes a difference how you receive it. So if you choose to go down the path of doing some of these tests, some of the most valuable information you'll ever get is, here's how other people might perceive you. And then going one step further, here's all of the results from the people you work with. This is how you might want to adapt your communication style, your working style, in order to get the best out of everybody, essentially. And I think that, because saying to people, oh, self-awareness comes from introspection, there are books, I'm a big Brené Brown fan. I think everybody is. You can read some of her books, you can apply some of her principles, you can go down the kind of personal development route. But I think sometimes just taking like an MBTI can really open up space for you to think about things you already know about yourself, potentially present you with some things that you weren't aware of previously, and then apply that knowledge to all of the people you work with, to give you an awareness of how they process you and how they process the world. Because I think the basis of self-awareness is initially having the space to reflect that not everyone experiences the world the way we do. And I think that's probably, it sounds really obvious, but certainly for someone like me, to actually go through the apparent awakening of, not everyone's like me. Because that's a lesson I learned in my leadership journey, right? That I can go from 1 to 10 in about 30 seconds, because I will read the first 2 sentences of something, decide I've got enough information, make a decision, and off I go. And I expect that other people will be moving at the same speed as me, and that they're coming along with me, and they're not. And I haven't created the space for them to ask me questions. I haven't really given them a good reason about where my decision came from. And just being aware of that means that I can fill the gap, essentially. So I think there's books, there's tools, there's journaling prompts and stuff like that. But I think that ultimately it has to come from curiosity more than anything else, about, okay, how do I get the best out of me, but also how do other people perceive me? And you can ask for feedback directly as well. If you are working in a team where you've got a high level of trust, direct feedback is often quite a good way of approaching how other people see you.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of things that were really interesting, and you mentioned Brené Brown. I love her as well, and I would like to chime in another person. I came across Michael Singer. Michael
Hmm.
Singer is somebody who, and some people might just know this. I was talking about the inner critics in some few podcasts that I did. He's basically looking at, what you perceive outside there, and how you deal with your emotions. So he talks about the voice in your head. It's basically it talks to you nonstop. We call it the inner critic. I actually have a name for it. I call it Ted. And sometimes Ted can be very loud and very chatty and so on. But
Hmm.
this is your voice. That's not you. I think the first step of identifying that there are two kind of parts, that you need to really distinguish is really, really important. And often it doesn't really have anything to do with the outside world. So sometimes we go into our days and this inner critic tells us, you need to behave in a certain way, or you influence like that. Or it sets almost the agenda like, today is a bad day, nothing is going to happen good to me, this is how we do it. And then you roll with this, and you basically you apply this almost almost automatically to your behavior as a leader when you go to an office or when you just speak with your teams and so on, because you do this. So self-awareness for me is basically understanding there is something that is your inner critic or the other voice, and there is something that is you. And I think that's really, really important to distinguish this. But also, what Michael Singer says is what we always try to do is to match what we believe the reality is what our belief system is with the outside world. And if it doesn't work, then we get angry, for example. So understanding these trigger points is important as well. So for example, I like, if people just, as you said as well, work very orderly and very quick and, just come to the point and so on, because this is how I brought up. And this is kind of part of me that I need to identify. But as you said, it's quite important to just stop for a minute and just realize that's you. Where does it come from? And that other people are different. And then to open up and see like, you're this kind of type, Thomas, great. But you deal with Joe, who is completely different and loves to think about other things. And you are aware and you need to bring this up. So I think for me, it would be finally to just hold on for a minute before you just go into your day. Have a breather and just think, okay, that's coming my way today. Let me show up in a good way. Let me show up with respect. Let me show up and go to people and treat them with the respect and the fairness by just controlling myself first before I just, kind of continue into my flow.
100%. Totally agree.
Yeah, so that's, I think, quite important. I also want to talk to you about biases. I think
Mhm.
that's quite important as well. In particular, I think in the revenue functions, or let's put it that way, my bias is that I experience biases in the revenue function, in particular when it comes to having favorite departments that you'd like to work with, favorite people, and so on and so on. And then sometimes you tend to ignore folks. So we in CS, for example, we sometimes like to create our silo and we just say, well, I don't want to work with product because, it's just them, or this.
Mhm.
And we got encouraged to work cross-functionally. But it's really difficult for some folks because they leave their silo. And I think psychology here plays a role as well, and just giving up biases, for example, on the way of how we think about people, how we hire people, and so on and so on. And just actively just saying, all right, I'm tearing down my walls here and my perception, and I'm just
Mhm.
making the first step because all over and now it's going to be good.
Sure.
What is your kind of take on biases in particular?
Oh, yeah, hot topic, and particularly around recruitment and team building, because I think that this is a cultural thing, and it's been culturally built into the way that we work at the moment. That these kind of horrible biases towards a specific type of behavior, towards a specific type of person, towards alphas, dominant personality types, like the whole culture of A's higher A's. It's not true, because define what an A is. Like, everyone has merit, and I I might be I'm definitely an optimist and a glass half full person, but I honestly believe that everyone who's coming to work is trying their hardest. So by arbitrarily measuring people against standards which essentially were built by consulting companies in hardcore software companies in the 90s in the USA, you're essentially measuring a whole raft of people with their own strengths and weaknesses and their own kind of pros and cons against a measurement standard which essentially has been created for white dudes, white middle class dudes in consulting firms. And it doesn't really allow for neurodivergence. It doesn't allow for personalities. It doesn't allow for even the introvert extrovert scale, as kind of reductionist as that is, because ultimately if you're in sales, for instance, you have to be an extrovert. That's just the rule. But some of the best salespeople I know are not extroverts, and I think that the only real way to counter biases is to be aware of them and to actively break them down. And I'm not going to go into politics because it's an ultimate trigger subject of mine, but we labour under the situation that we have, which essentially has been built to uphold the structures of colonialism, patriarchy, all of that sort of stuff. And when you actually engage with conversations around the types of biases that we hold and accept that you yourself have biases and they're cultural, right? And the ways in which you want to automatically respond to stimuli are built over years because of the place that you grew up and the people that you grew up with and the time that you grew up and all of these sorts of things. And there's nothing inherently wrong with having a bias, but it's how you respond to the bias and how you let the bias control you that causes the problem. And it's do you challenge your own biases? Are you actively looking to bring people into your team to increase the diversity of that team? Because the data suggests very heavily that more diverse teams in terms of sexuality, race, background will perform better over time because you have a multitude of different opinions. So I think the only way to handle biases, and this has been proven, is to actually actively challenge them through work that is done by amazing DEI professionals who are just getting people to think about perspectives other than their own. And I guess it comes back to what we were talking about with self-awareness. Most people don't necessarily think about their privilege is a great example. Like I'm a native English speaker. It's my first language. I realized, and it sounds really stupid and really, really arrogant, but a couple of years ago, I remember thinking, it's actually a real privilege to be a native English speaker. And I just roll into meetings expecting that we'll be talking in English and everyone will be fine, even though I might be able to and can speak other languages. It's just not a thing that happens. So recognizing that privilege just gives me the ability to reflect on that and think about the way in which that I want to present myself and the language that I'm using, because equally, I fairly colloquially British. I say things that other non-native English speakers wouldn't understand. And even if you compare things that I would say versus things an American would say, for instance, because we have different cultural framings, it might not make sense. So without going off on too much of a tangent, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with biases, because that's the psychological principle, right? We want to make friends with people who look like us, who have the same background as us, who have the same experiences as us. That's an in-group. And we naturally are more suspicious of people who sit in an out-group, who aren't like us, because in an evolutionary perspective, that's how we've evolved. But if you're aware of that, and if you're self-aware enough to know that you're potentially biasing one person over another because, they live near you, they want to go out drinking with you, they look like you, they like the same things as you, then you can actively change your behavior. So I don't think biases are the problem. I think it's an awareness of bias, and I think it's how you let those biases then affect your behavior and how they show up for you that causes the challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you said this about English not being your first language, which is, for example, my case, but also when I worked globally for Discovery, and I was in charge of collecting research information across 52 markets, I dealt with different nations, nationalities, and so on. And you're absolutely right. I think being aware of your biases and making sure you adapt is something you can actually, you should be aware of, but actually you could improve and train as well going forward. And I encourage everyone to do this and just do this literally as a daily exercise, because that's a muscle that needs to be trained and needs to be, kind of activated, I think, every day, because otherwise we just fall back. And that's unfortunately how we tick, how we are. But I think you're just keeping up with, just being aware, because it is greater when we are diverse. It is greater when we just come together and listening to other voices, and bring other perspectives into the room. So that's quite important. I would love to talk to you about mental well-being and customer success for a second. And I think this is a topic that is quite apparent, because we were talking suddenly about, our community needs to move from value building and making sure we are caring about our customers. And a lot of us did this in the past to, carry quota, become, commercially savvy, closing deals, and then basically getting into this fear mode of now wearing a sales hat. Right. So we both have been on both sides. It's easy for us, right, to talk about both and potentially also adapt. But I am assuming there are a lot of folks outside there who just are scared. Combine that with AI technology, it's another factor, that is getting bigger and bigger in terms of fear. So mental well-being is a topic, right? So as a leader, how would you spot this when, in your team? How would you see the first signs of people are getting unwell?
I think for me, I've always been able to spot overwhelm in the way people approach task delivery, specifically the folks who are always saying yes, and the ones who just will continue to accept work from you, and then not necessarily deliver it on time, or be delivering things that aren't necessarily up to the quality that you would normally expect from them. And I think you can always tell when you talk to people. I think the first rule of leadership is never skip your one-on-ones, right? It's actually talk to people and make sure that you as a leader are letting your team drive the content of those one-to-ones. Because I think the way that people talk about things, you can tell what their energy is like. And I know from teams that I've led and people that I've led specifically, some people will be more inclined to tell you how they feel, some people won't. But if you have a high level of emotional intelligence, and if you have been training the muscle to actually listen to the things that people aren't saying versus what they are saying, you'll be able to tell the difference. And I think a lot of this also comes down to, as a leader, what behavior are you modeling? Are you modeling the always on? Are you modeling the replying to Slack at midnight? Are you modeling the I'm available all the time, just book time in my calendar? Or are you actually allowing your team to effectively benchmark? And are you talking to them about what their boundaries are around, I need you to do this, but in return, I want you to deprioritize this? And I think, again, it comes to a level of awareness, because ultimately, as a leader, you're probably under all of this pressure too. And you're not necessarily having somebody look out for you, especially if you're at that first line level. Because if you're managing a team of ICs, your job essentially is to make sure that the people who are doing the job are okay and that they're doing it and everything's going well. But you're also having all of the pressure from senior leadership kind of on your shoulders. And it's unlikely that anyone's really checking in on your well-being. So you do have to look after yourself and recognize when you're letting that pressure roll downhill. And that has definitely been one of the big learnings of my career, is that you can't just take the message you're getting from senior leadership, because it's often quite sharp. You have to then translate it into, this is what I'm going to give to my team and the direction that I'm going to focus them on. And sometimes that message that you're getting from senior leadership, I'm sure you've been in one of these positions, Thomas, doesn't make a lot of sense, or maybe keeps changing, or isn't very stable, or isn't very structured. And you somehow have to turn that noise into a structure for your team to give them the stability they need to execute for their customers. And that's a really hard job. And I think understanding that as soon as you feel like you might be becoming overwhelmed, that's a good time to check in with your team, because it's a good chance that some of that's rubbing off on them, because as you absorb more pressure, you're naturally probably going to be giving it to other people, but also checking in and making sure that you're looking after yourself and that you're creating that space for them to talk to you. Because I think that's the most important thing, is having that open door and being the sort of person who somebody could come and tell you that they were struggling. I've always prided myself on that. I've always hoped that for the people that I've managed, they could turn up to me and be like, I'm struggling, help. And I would help them prioritize. And And I think that's an approach. That's just that's a management style that you can pick. But in terms of spotting, to go back to your original question, I don't know if you've got any particular strategy for this, but it does typically tend to come in abrupt change in communication style, quality of work dipping, or potentially it will ripple through the rest of the team. Because if you're stressed, the way that you behave with everyone else will change. And I think you've got to be quite switched on as a leader to sense those subtleties.
Yeah. For me, it's I normally have a baseline or now a baseline for my individual contributors. So I know how he or she basically behaves and what's the kind of normal state. And if I see there's a difference, being very euphoric, being sad, being what you, for example, said, like delivering on the performance or set performance, then that is my first kind of port of call to just check in and do this. And as I love to have a culture of just speak up, talk to me anytime if there's anything that you need to discuss. And I do this, and I did this from the very beginning. And sometimes when I spot there's a difference from the baseline that I figure out with folks, I'm very proactive. I say, like, hey, hold on, can we just hold on for a second? And I know we're talking about your account planning for next year, whatsoever, but I spot there's something not right here. Can you just help me just understanding this a little bit? So I'm going into coaching questions, and I want them to just open up and for them to find the words and the approach to just come up. But they know, I know. And this is something that they know, I will know, and I will basically come up with this question. And I hope that in my past, in my career so far, that this kind of was a compound way of building trust with my folks and just saying, hey, let's do this. And I had a couple of situations where just folks called me at 7 p.m. and said, like, Thomas, I'm sorry, but we need to talk. And these people really kind of warmed up. And I think that's extremely important. So that's, I think, spotting for me the things. So baseline and then seeing, is there a difference? And the other point that you mentioned is kind of, what are you doing with this kind of downstream pressure on, that comes sometimes from senior management, and how to translate this? That's a tough one, to be honest. In particular, if you are on the front line to your senior execs and you need to deliver, you need to tell the story why you didn't you reach your targets, or you're just ending up at 60% against quota, whatever, then I think that's tough, and you are under stress. So you need to be self-aware, manage you, and then you need to go back to your team. I found this, to be honest, tough, and I sometimes struggled very much. So and I think I will, and that's, I feel, for me as a leader, sometimes the most overwhelming parts, where I just simply need to remove myself out of the situation and say, like, give me a minute. And if I'm in the office, I just literally leave the office and I say, like, okay, give me a minute, I go out. Or I just need a breather to just collect myself, which really helps, simple things like that. So we were talking about us as leaders spotting mental health issues maybe with our teams. So what about the team members, CSMs, if they feel like, I don't really think I don't feel well, what would you say they should do?
I think it depends. It depends on each of us individually. I think for me, whenever I have been talking to people that I've coached and people who've worked for me and people I've worked with over the years, overwhelm often comes from feeling like you are out of control. So it's this concept of like learned helplessness, where it doesn't matter what I do, I can't make an impact. Therefore, I might as well do nothing. And it's kind of that sort of spiral, because burnout in particular tends to be more emotional. It's overwhelming. You've got all of this stuff piled on top of you, and it doesn't really matter which direction you go in. There's no winning. I know when I felt at one of my lowest, it was at the point where I was like, it doesn't really matter what I do today. I can't make a difference. I will not win. There is no way forward here. And I think when you're thinking about that, there's a few things that you can do short term and then longer term to kind of help with that. And the first one is time management. Like if you really critically look at where you're spending your time and just immediately cut everything that is a time drain. And I know that particularly for CSMs who spend a lot of time dealing with things like support tickets or answering product questions, a lot of these things, it's not a value add. And if it's not a value add, it's a time drain. And I think that sometimes focusing on things that you can control and things that you can do makes a big difference. And as a leader in particular, if one of your team is overwhelmed and you look at their time and they're spending all their time dealing with support tickets, that's on you as well, because that shouldn't really be the case. But two, that's a systemic problem. It's telling you something about the way in which your support team are working, or the way in which your customers are being told about how things work at your business, or something is systemically wrong ultimately. So time management is one thing. The second thing I think is more immediately, how big of a problem is this? Is this a 2-week holiday? Is this a 3-week sabbatical or 3-month sabbatical, something slightly longer? Is this a cultural fit? Because quite often, some of the times where I've been in situations where I felt the most low, burnt out, let's say, and I felt it from some of my team, it's just been, well, this is not a culture fit. You're in the wrong place. This is the wrong company, or this is the wrong leadership style, or this is the wrong person. And I know that if I've been working for somebody that I just haven't jived with, that's caused all sorts of problems. And as consequently, and again, if you look at kind of research and certainly what a lot of people talk about on LinkedIn, you work for your boss, right? Your boss is the one thing that will determine whether or not you're happy at work. So if you're working for the wrong person, you have to ask yourself, right, am I in the right place? And sometimes as a leader, you do need to ask your team that question. Like, is this the right job for you? Is this the right role? Is this the right place? Am I the right boss for you? You have to put your mental health first, ultimately, if this is a constant chronic stress pattern ultimately. And then I think building on from time management, how are you looking after yourself? Are you always on? Do you have Slack on your personal phone? Do you make time to cook yourself dinner, to go to the gym, to walk the dog, to make sure that you're having dinner with your family? Do you have time in the morning to have a coffee with your partner and take your kids to school? Or do you just feel completely overwhelmed? And how are you actually blocking out time for your life? Because like I said before, there is no such thing as work-life balance. There's just life. And if you're becoming overwhelmed because there's just too much stuff and it's starting to affect the people around you and the people that you, no offense, because I care about all of my colleagues, but the people you actually care about, like your family and the people that will miss you if you're not there, for instance, it will have knock-on impacts. And I think that as long as you are trying to create space for yourself, I think getting in charge of your time and where you're putting your time and your energy is probably one of the most impactful things everyone can do. And as a leader, if one of your team is struggling, I would strongly encourage you to make sure that they are deleting Slack off their personal phone, even if it's just for the short term. Like you cannot be working after hours. You need that space, you need that division. Things like a lot of us are remote these days. What does your work environment look like? Do you have the right setup? Is it in a different room where you can physically close the door and leave? Like, what's your wind down routine? I used to read my book when I was in the office every day. I'd sit on the tube and I'd read my book. And for that 20 to 40, sometimes much longer, if any of you got experience with London transport, for those times I was trying to get home, I was reading my book and I was physically winding down and my brain was switching into socializing. And when I started working from home, there just wasn't that split anymore. So I went from work to not work, and there was just no transition time. So now, instead of doing that, at the end of the day, I move to a different chair, but I read a book, and I just change and have that kind of wind down. So I would always encourage people to really critically look at where you're spending your time, because at work, there's a good chance that you're spending a lot of time on activities which don't add value to you, and you can either ask your boss to help you reprioritize, or if you're the leader, you can ask your team to reprioritize the work that they're doing in terms of, okay, how can I help? What can I take away? What is the time drain here? But more than that, how are you building your life around work? How are you creating that separation? And what are you doing to prioritize yourself? Because self-care is not just about looking after yourself. It's about making sure that you have the mental capacity to show up for the people around you that need you. Like, for instance, I have to go to the gym a certain number of times a week. And if I don't make time to do that, I'm a horrible person to a lot of people. And it's just not worth it. So it's not selfish, it's prioritization of yourself so that you can present the world in the best possible way, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. There was a lot in it, Emma. I love this. And I'm very grateful we host this session at the moment, because I think this is so important what you just said. These things about, being self-aware of knowing, what's important, but also setting boundaries, right, to yourself, and making sure you really function in some ways. And you can control a lot. Just want to add one more thing, and it's an outcome of a coaching session that I actually had yesterday. And this person really struggled with their manager, and I could so relate, because so often we are just focused on our direct manager, and we see that person is, basically the god. It represents the company, represents on how we have to structure our life. I think I encourage everyone to just, look out for potentially other leaders as well, and, in other companies, and just connect, and get a second opinion, or build rapport to other leaders in the company as well, and to just, get some more connection, some more dots and some more contacts in the company, to just get a validation of that. Do not just see work as a relationship that you have with your direct manager. There are so many others. Also reach out to your peers going forward. And as you know, there are so many different other ways these days where you can just look for help online, for example, and which are affordable, and nobody really has to suffer. But again, it brings us down to self-awareness, right? Knowing how you feel, that you feel not okay, I think is the first step to then really just go and do this exercise for you and understand what is it. And that's, for me, just going through this also cognitively and just asking these questions, why my manager behaves like he or she does, helps me to just, understand the context a little bit better, and for us then to have more advice and a better understanding of how we need to move, or how we need to classify our emotions going forward. Emma, I can talk to you like forever, and I just discovered we just have 50 more minutes left. This is incredible. So let's move to leadership.
Okay.
This is obviously a leadership topic and a leadership podcast, and I would love to talk to you a little bit about mistakes and learnings. So, what was the biggest mistake you made as a CS leader?
Oh God, there's too many. There's too many. I think one of the biggest ones is, I already kind of mentioned it. I assume that everyone works like me, works at my pace, likes the chaos that I work in, likes to do 12 things at once. And that's led to quite a lot of fallout from the team who, let me think about this one example where everything was pretty much in my head. I was working for a small company, and I'd been the only person for a really long time. So all of our processes, not that there were that many, but everything was in my head. I knew everything. And the dissemination of that information was just awful, because I didn't know that everyone else didn't know, if that makes sense. So I was just assuming that everyone did. And making decisions. So if I maybe give you some context about how I make decisions. I like the TLDR summary of things. I can't cope with lots of information. I'll get the gist, and then I'll make a decision, and then we're off and we're going in a direction. And that doesn't necessarily work for everyone. And my biggest leadership learning was that if you don't spend time explaining to people how you got to that decision, then they're not going to buy in. And if your team are not bought in, it doesn't really matter what you do or how great you are, it's not going to work. So I then started to realize that clarity is far more important than certainty, because for the most part, I don't know, this probably won't be a revelation to anyone, but the leader probably doesn't know the right answer. Leaders are only leaders because we've got oftentimes a lot of experience, but all a leader really does is looks at the data, applies their experience, and makes a hypothesis about what we think we should do, and we go and we try that. And if you can be clear with your team about how that's just a hypothesis, and I'm not entirely sure if it's going to work or not, but we'll figure this out together. But here's how I got to the decision about where we're going and what we're going to do. Here's why we're doing it. And if you take the time to explain the why, people will be far more comfortable with the uncertainty and the ambiguity. And that was the biggest lesson that I ever learned, was because I was just like, this way. Everyone was like, yeah, but why? Why are we doing that? This doesn't make sense. We should be doing this. This is the way we've always done it. And this comes down to change management, which you mentioned earlier. You know, people are generally quite happy with ambiguity as long as they understand how you got to where you are now. And I think that's when someone says to me, what's your biggest leadership lesson? It's always that. What's my biggest leadership learning? It's usually always that. Clarity will get you everywhere. It works in negotiations. It works with customers. Every single time I've tried to bluff my way out of a situation where a product feature hasn't existed and the customers wanted an update, every single time I've tried to bluff my way out of it, it has not worked, ever. Every single time I've said to a customer, I understand, this is where we are, this is where we're going, and this is how we're going to do it, they've been fine with the fact that that product feature doesn't work or hasn't existed. Clarity is the most important thing in almost every situation, regardless of who you're working with. What's yours?
It's very similar. I think I like to jump the gun. I just said, hey, that's my mission. Just copy paste. Hey, that's the quickest way. I've know it all. I've got the blueprint. I've got the playbook. Here we are. And to be honest, I had some issues in my current role where I just came to clients and just said, well, here's the framework. We just do it like that. So basically, not being aware of that, I need to do one simple exercise first, which is called listening to my stakeholders. And you just make not mature decisions. You are just jumping the gun. And that's because you believe you know it, and you believe it falls all into places, and you just don't give yourself the breather, the kind of 2 seconds sometimes, the ability to just say, all right, I'm pulling myself back and playing the coach here and just asking a question and put myself in an observing role going forward. Because I've learned this the hard way. I think this is where I made hopefully some progress, but that was at the beginning really my biggest mistake. And I jumped into a silo, and I found myself there more or less being alone and not having any buy-in. So you see the ripple effect of this behavior is just massive. And this is where people just being perceived as, the quirky leaders, the people who do not care and whatsoever, because often it's just fear-driven and not opening up, not allowing yourself time to just cut through the noise and the stream and the hectic, and then just run on yourself is a sign of just of weakness and just of insecurity. So knowing that and just putting your foot on the brake, I think is super, super important. And again, this is something you could learn going forward. We'd love to talk to you about future of customer success leadership before we just come to the final topic, which is balance. So we are now May 2025. We've got a couple of months in, and we know AI is going to change, I think, our life massively, even more. What do you think, future of customer success leadership? If you picture yourself or us as leaders, let's say in two years, so I'm not going to reach to the stars, but 2 years, what do you think will change most leaders in customer success?
Good question. I think that, and this is already happening, right? I think the shift towards commercial awareness is only going to get more acute, because whether or not you are part of a CS team that owns a number, the fact is that you need to quantify what you do and how valuable it is for your business. And it's the so what part of the sentence. Like, no one cares that you did 20 QBRs. They care about how much pipeline you generated, and of that pipeline, how much revenue was closed. And I think that will continue to be driven. If you don't want to be a cost center, even if you technically are, because you don't own a revenue number, you have to be able to explain and understand how your business makes money and how you support that goal, and to articulate that. Because a lot of the time, it's not that your CEO or your CRO doesn't appreciate CS, it's that they don't know how to, because you're not giving them the tools to do it. I also think that it will see, and again, we are seeing, and I think this will become more apparent as we continue to build, using AI, a more digital touch approach to CS across all of our customers. But we'll start to see CS being kind of a key linchpin, more so than it already is, in the kind of go-to-market motion, because someone has to hold the balance between holding sales, holding their feet to the fire for bringing in ICP customers and customers that can be successful with the product based on the problem that we agreed we were trying to solve. Holding product accountable, because a lot of customers that I speak to, a lot of companies I speak to, we have a problem with customer growth, is what I hear. But they don't have a problem with customer growth. They have a problem with product delivery and product delivering relevant features so that you can grow customers. Like there's a dichotomy there, right? Your product won't grow organically. You have to keep developing novelty. And if you're not doing that, it's often because your product strategy isn't aligned to the problem you're trying to solve for your customer, who is both your new business and your expansion sale, or you're developing random features for customers to fill gaps based on customer feedback. And that, again, customer success is accountable for that, right? Because as a customer success leader, you hear all of this feedback, but you have to make a decision about which customers' feedback is prioritizable, I suppose, because you can't be everything for everyone. So you owe the business the clarity of communication in terms of, we've got some customers asking for this, but I don't think it's a commercially viable thing for us as a business to be building because it doesn't align to this particular customer profile that we're working towards. And I think it's taking that seat at the table to hold tension for growth. I think that's where we're going, because you have to have somebody holding product and sales and marketing accountable for talking about the right things and delivering the right things for the customer that you as a leadership team identified and a problem that you identified you wanted to solve. But you do also have to represent your customers as well. But I feel like a lot of CS teams, there's no filtering between all of these product feature requests and all of these bugs that customers are pushing up. And then that's keeping your product team busy doing fixes and building hot features for customers on the fly to retain them, which means your product team aren't focusing on building the next big thing, which means you're going to have a growth problem later down the line because you've got nothing to sell to your existing customers. So it's understanding how businesses operate and being very key as part of that go-to-market growth engine, because you all have to be aligned. And I think you talked a lot about silos, Thomas. There's the days of sales being over here and then throwing stuff over the fence, and then product and engineering and CS and support all fighting with each other to then ultimately hopefully retain some customers. That's over. You all have to be aligned to be moving in the same direction.
Yeah. I was speaking about this alignment, and I actually was suggesting a new function in the C-suite, and it's called the Chief Go-to-Market Officer, which basically looks after customer success, or comes potentially out of the customer success area, but also overlooks, the entire go-to-market ecosystem, including product. Because what you just said, I think it's key in terms of efficiency, but also when we talk about AI efficiency and how AI can help us, to have a leader in this space who just is responsible for a go-to-market or for the go-to-market motions, and who just basically reports holistically about growth and adaptation and so on and so on. And I think that in 2 years' time, I believe we will see these kind of leadership roles in particular. And I think the other point would be, there must be a fluency in AI going forward. I just dove into writing my own AI agents, and what I saw by following folks like Jordan Crawford, for example, who is a go-to-market engineer, is just incredible when we talk about new ability to just reach out to customers, create value. There's just not like, oh, I've seen you posted this, or but really kind of going beyond understanding what customers know at the moment. And this is going to blow our minds. And I think in 2 years' time, I don't really believe we can imagine what's going to happen in 2 years, but what we should be prepared of, I think, not only as leaders, but all generally in CS and go-to-market, is just learn that shit. Sorry, but just be open. Just go with the flow. Put the effort in, because otherwise you've just been left out, I'm afraid. And that's it. Let's close out with, and I recall this balance. And because we talk about psychology, I want to talk to you very quickly about balance. I know you love going to the gym, but I know you love yoga, right?
Mhm,
So tell us
mhm.
a little bit about how do you kind of find balance in your life, in your work life that's just actually your life, as you said.
I think it's about feeding it into the day and about bringing certain things forward. And without going too much into yoga philosophy, I could talk for hours about how yoga philosophies impact leadership, um, but I won't. And I think it's about making sure that you're building your day to reflect your best energy. So somebody asked me earlier, what time of day do you normally start work? And I'm like, about 10. And people, that's late, isn't it? And I'm like, not for me, because I'm an owl, right? I do my best work at 7 p.m. That's just how I roll. That's how my brain works. And I think making sure that you're taking a lunch break, and on that lunch break, you might get up and stretch, or you might, just get out I never do this, but you could roll out a yoga mat and you could just move about a bit. You could go for a walk. You could just make sure that you had a sandwich for once. I think a lot of balance comes from making sure that you are refilling your bucket rather than just completely depleting it all of the time. And it's a hard learnt lesson for me, because I've burnt myself into the ground, and I'm sure a lot of people have. But if you don't look after yourself, if you're not refueling, if you're not maintaining this element of balance, and this, I will talk about yoga a little bit, this attachment to an outcome, because the only thing you can control is your energy. You can only control your energy and your focus and your time and where you spend it. You can work as hard as you want on something, but it still might not work out in the way that you thought it would or the way you want it to. But that doesn't mean that your energy was poorly spent. So this disattachment from an outcome in particular is the easiest way of building mental resilience, to say, I can only control my energy. I'm doing the best job I can in the situation I'm in, and I'm trying as hard as I can. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And it's that kind of creating that space for you mentally to become more resilient towards failure. I think that's practicing those sorts of maneuvers is usually quite helpful.
Yeah, yeah. Just I can completely relate to this. And now, having worked in a corporate world, and that kind of almost set a little bit the agenda, and now work for myself, I sense that my body is completely ticks differently. While you maybe start at 10, my ideal working hours are between 7 and 10. This is, yeah, I love this. I wake up and literally I just have a coffee and start, and then I can actually work for 3 hours. That's my most creative time, and knowing that. But then I also know everything beyond 4 p.m. is, I can do like a little bit of here and there, but knowing that my biorhythm is a different one, and that when it's my most creative time, it's super important, to kind of structure my day, but also pack some work into these slots going forward.
Oh.
Before we close out, do you have any book recommendations or podcast recommendations for our viewers and listeners that you would like to share that are related to this podcast episode?
Oh, I've got loads. I'm a book person, so the one that I would say is if you really want to apply the principles of psychology to other people, it's a book called Influence by Robert Cialdini. It is the psychology of influence, and it's incredibly useful if you're in any kind of role where you're trying to convince somebody that they need or want something. It's the best book for you. I would say Grit by Angela Duckworth. That's about resilience, and it's about the art of trying harder and how you cultivate failure and resilience. And then probably Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, which is an overview of the science of how we make decisions and how our unconscious dictates what those decisions are for the most part. And it's a really, really good book. And I would get into that. If you're interested in how your brain works and how you can start to not necessarily hack, but how you can understand how you make your decisions, I'd start there.
Amazing. Emma, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I love this conversation. I think I learned quite a bit from you, I think our viewers and listeners, I'm assuming as well. Thank you very much for taking the time and just being here on this live. If you guys have any questions, I will stick around for another 10 minutes or so you can ask questions. I know Krista has raised your question, your arm. Please do so. For everyone else who needs to go, please feel free. Otherwise, as I said, we're going to be here for a couple of more minutes for your questions.
Thank you.
Chris?